I emerged into a small burial ground. It was enclosed by the remains of a wall. I stopped in astonishment at the sight. There were perhaps 50 old gravestones, most of them leaning over or completely fallen, covered in patches of greenish-yellow lichen and moss, scoured pale by the salt wind and stained by years of driven rain. The mounds were grassy and weed-covered, or else they disappeared altogether, sunken and slipped down. No names and dates were now decipherable, and the whole place had a decayed and abandoned air. Suddenly conscious of the cold and extreme bleakness and eeriness of the spot and of the gathering dusk of the November afternoon, and not wanting my spirits to become so depressed that I might begin to be affected by all sorts of morbid fancies, I was about to leave and walk briskly back to the house, where I intended to switch on a good many lights and to even light a small fire if that were possible, before beginning my preliminary work on Mrs. Drabblow's papers. But as I turned away, I glanced once again around the burial ground, and then I saw again the woman with the wasted face who had been at Mrs. Drabblow's funeral. She was at the far end of the plot, close to one of the few upright headstones, and she wore the same clothing and bonnet, but it seemed to have slipped back so that I could make out her face a little more clearly. In the greyness of the fading light, it had the sheen and pallor not of flesh so much as of bone itself. Earlier, when I'd looked at her, although admittedly that had been scarcely more than a swift glance each time, I had not noticed any particular expression on her ravaged face, but then I had, after all, been entirely taken with her look of extreme illness. Now, however, as I stared at her, stared until my eyes ached in their sockets, stared in surprise and bewilderment at her presence, now I saw that her face did wear an expression. Was one of what I can only describe, and the words seem hopelessly inadequate to express what I saw, as a desperate, yearning malevolence. It was as though she was searching for something she wanted, needed, must have, more than life itself, and which had been taken from her. And towards whoever had taken it, she directed the purest evil and hatred and loathing, with all the force that was available to her. Her face, in its extreme pallor, her eyes, sunken but unnaturally bright, were burning with a concentration of passionate emotion which was within her and which streamed from her. Whether or not this hatred and malevolence was directed towards me, I had no means of telling. I had no reason at all to suppose that it could possibly have been, but at that moment I was far from able to base my reactions upon reason or logic. But the combination of the peculiar, isolated place and the sudden appearance of the woman and the dreadfulness of her expression began to fill me with fear. Indeed, I had never in my life been so possessed by it, never known my knees to tremble and my flesh to creep, and then to turn cold as stone, never known my heart to give a great lurch as if it would almost leap up into my mouth and begin pounding in my chest like a hammer on an anvil, never known myself gripped and held fast by such dread and horror and apprehension of evil. It was as though I had become paralysed. I could not bear to stay there for fear, but nor had I any strength left in my body to turn and run away, and I was as certain as I had ever been of anything that at any second I could drop dead on that wretched patch of ground. It was the woman who moved. She slipped behind the gravestone and, keeping close to the shadow of the wall, went through one of the broken gaps and out of sight. The very second that she'd gone, my nerve and the power of speech and movement, my very sense of life itself, came flooding back through me. My head cleared, and all at once I was angry, yes, angry, with her for the emotion she'd aroused in me, for causing me to experience such fear, and the anger led at once to determination, to follow her and to stop her, and then to ask some questions and receive proper replies, to get to the bottom of it all. I ran quickly and lightly over the short stretch of rough grass between the graves towards the gap in the wall, and came out almost on the edge of the estuary. At my feet the grass gave way within a yard or two to sand and then to shallow water. All around me the marshes and the flat salt dunes stretched away until they merged with the rising tide. I could see for miles, but there was no sign at all of the woman in black, nor any place in which she could have concealed herself. Who she was, or what, and how she had vanished, such questions I did not ask myself. I tried not to think about the matter at all, but with the very last of the energy that I could already feel draining out of me rapidly, I turned and I began to run, to flee from the graveyard and the ruins, and to put the woman at so great a distance behind as I possibly could. I concentrated everything upon my running, hearing only the thud of my own body on the grass and the escape of my own breath. And I did not look